Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on adopting a design-first approach with OAS 3 and Swagger. My name is Ryan. I'm here joined with Nathan. And today we're going to be walking through how to adopt a design-first workflow for your API development, specifically using the Swagger tools, and we'll dig into the spec and some of the changes that have happened. A few housekeeping items before we get started. I just want to let everyone know we will be sharing a recording of today's webinar, so keep an eye out for that. And we will also be trying to save as much time as we can for Q&A. The webinar should run for about 60 minutes here, but we want to make sure we save plenty of time at the end to answer any of your questions that come up. So do feel free to put them in as the webinar goes along. But at this time, I'm going to pass off to Nathan, and we'll jump in and get started.
Both Ryan and I here are a part of SmartBear, very quickly growing company supporting a number of different products and platforms, focused really on accelerating the development lifecycle at all stages. Obviously, today we'll be talking mostly about design and API development. We also play with testing as well as monitoring solutions. And finally, we have like a whole nother layer or abstraction for UI, which we'll present in just a second here. One of the interesting things that I think separates us from a lot of other folks out there is the devotion or the support we put out for the open source community. So we can see that number, 6.5 million users. That is both paid customers as well as our open source customers. Most people on the line today are probably familiar with the OpenAPI spec or the Swagger tools, which of course are open source solutions. And then we have a professional grade piece of that as well in Swagger Hub that we're kind of working inside of today. Very similar kind of thing with like SOAP UI. So we have an API testing tool. It's been around for a number of years, as the name alludes, since SOAP testing was really the way to go. And we also have a professional version of that. So we really try and foster this kind of relationship with the open source groups. We offer tools and solutions at that level, but also provide value and platforms for larger organizations, enterprise teams, anybody looking for more advanced or streamlined functionality. We kind of have a nice evolution from that open source into the rest of the platforms that we build. So just to see where we kind of stand in the development process or in our tooling lifecycle, these are almost all of the solutions that SmartBear provides today. Right along the bottom, what we'll really be interested in today, in the bottom left is Swagger Hub. So that's the initial stage of API development. We can think of this, obviously, we're going to be taking a design first kind of look at API development, and Swagger Hub is a great solution for that. The specification that we generate either through Swagger Hub or through the other Swagger tooling can be then picked up in a number of other different tools. So if we wanted to get into testing, we could definitely upload it or move it into the SOAP UI Pro platform. If we wanted to virtualize it, something that I see a lot of people starting to do, and something that we'll talk about a little bit in just a few minutes. We do have a solution for that. Makes it very easy to essentially upload Surface or Swagger into this Surface V tool, creates all of our request responses. We build out a little bit of logic, and we have a really powerful, dynamic, functional mock in just a few seconds. So some really interesting stuff there, especially when we're looking at this definition-driven or design-first approach. Finally, Load UI, exactly what it sounds like. It's a load testing tool for APIs. So we can take any of those scripts that we might have built out in SOAP UI, run them at scale, distribute across multiple machines, some really powerful pieces there. And again, focus strictly on APIs. So it's kind of a semi-codeless kind of approach to load testing, a little different than some of the other solutions. And again, really driven, supporting the API kind of space. We'll just take a quick look at the agenda that we'll be covering today. We'll get started, talk a little bit about the theory of what we're kind of going to lay out. So some of the issues that we might find with traditional development, why do we talk so much about design first, how it can start to help, why we see people start to transition. And we'll also present, okay, it's great in kind of this greenfield kind of space where we don't have an API that exists, or we're building out a new microservice or a new piece of functionality, but how can we leverage that design first component when the API already exists as well? So we'll definitely talk about that a little bit. We'll talk a little bit about OpenAPI, Swagger Hub, some of the different kind of components of the OpenAPI ecosystem. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between 2.0 and 3.0 and how it's kind of evolved over the past couple of years. And then we'll get into a demo. So we'll design a new API from scratch. We've got a little use case that we'll put together here and kind of map out. We'll take that design and kind of flesh it out a little bit in the editor. And then we'll talk, okay, what do we do next? It's like, it's great, we put out that V1, but now what do we do? How do we get feedback? How do we utilize that in a constructive way? How do we iterate on it and version it? Why would we do that, with this kind of design first tactic and some of the advantages there? So hopefully we can show the usability or the reasoning behind that during the demo portion. As Ryan mentioned, we'll also cover a bunch of questions, so feel free to post them in the chat. We'll keep an eye on that. So let's dive right into this little theory piece, just to kind of level set everybody on what we'll be talking about today. A lot of people that I talk to, and we work with a lot of different customers and different sized companies here at SmartBear, we see that there's a lot of people who still support this kind of traditional development model. Very commonly, we'll start out with a very high level plan, and this is when we're talking about something that might be kind of new. We'll start out with a high-level plan. We'll have a rough idea. Hey, we need this set of requirements fulfilled, or we have a team who's asking us for this kind of data or something like that. But really, we want to put together a plan that says, why are we going to spend our time and resources building this API? Who is it going to be designed for? Is this something public-facing? Is it internal? Is it team-based? Is it going to work with just an individual team that kind of runs in parallel to us? Or is it going to serve up data to the entire kind of internal company? And then really, what is its scope? What will it serve? How deep will it go? Like, what kind of data is it going to return? How flexible should it be? Is it a single kind of path that people are going to pull data from, or is it something that's a little more intuitive or has a little more depth to it? So really, we want to put that plan together. And then traditionally, we would take that plan, hand it off to our development team, and let them run with it, right? They will build code. They kind of start to create some functionality underneath it, fulfill the requirements in that plan, and start to build or write tests against that, either as part of the development process, or there's a QA team that works kind of after them and picks that code up and kind of validates it. But there's this chain of steps, right? And finally, once things are tested and built, we would stage that API. We would essentially expose it to those internal teams. We would expose it to maybe like a group of beta testers or a group of trusted third parties that we know we're going to eventually integrate with. And we get feedback. So, we set out with the original plan that, had the best intentions of serving up all the data that was required in the best way possible. But we really, typically don't get that feedback until we've put something together that people can come in and actually start to consume. Now, this is quite useful, and obviously we get that feedback. We can take it back into the build process, but there's a pretty significant amount of time between the code that we write, test, and stage and the feedback actually getting implemented. The way that we see development shifting and that the rate that we're seeing development progress with, it's really important that we try and shorten that cycle. So we need to look at interesting and clever new ways of doing something like getting feedback, which is an integral part of any kind of design or development process. And traditionally or typically will kind of come at the later stages once we actually have something that we can get feedback on. So that really lays the groundwork for how design first can help. We're still going to have that plan. We're still going to have that collection of loose ideas. They might come from like a business level, or they might come from conversations with other teams in the lunchroom or something like that. But the difference here is that we put that into a design. That design comes in a standard format, something that's both human and machine readable. And when we do that, we can actually get feedback at a much earlier stage. When we can translate that plan to something that's semi-functional, when we have it in a structure that is consumable, again, from kind of somebody like reading documentation, or we can create a mock service off the back of that, we can get feedback much, much earlier. And in that way, we can implement that feedback against the design before we move it on to the build. So when we actually start to write code, we're doing it against a very well thought out and validated design, as opposed to something that we will build and then get feedback on in this kind of looping process. Now, one of the other nice things there is that design is going to say exactly what it is we're going to be requiring from the request side, and also what we're going to be returning in our responses and all the different responses that we could potentially return. So we can actually build tests at the same time. And as opposed to us doing some kind of build or test or having our devs build and test in parallel, we can actually potentially hand those off to two teams. run that in parallel, and then when we start thinking about pushing things to a staged environment, we can actually use those tests as a validation point. And we see some really interesting workflows once we get into like behavior-driven development, mapping that to a design, once we kind of get into test-driven development and utilizing those tests to essentially have our developers fulfill those requirements or pass those tests to push code out. There's some really interesting ways that we can start to leverage that design. We can also stand up a very quick mock service, and something that I will talk a little bit more about when we get into like this best practices piece. But I think that this is a really neat idea where, let's forget writing code. Let's forget, taking the time to actually stand up that staging environment. We can actually utilize that design and very quickly stand up essentially a mock that looks and responds like an actual API. But without us actually taking the time to build out the kind of underlying structure or connect it to our database or make sure it's got the kind of proper authentication around it. We can really just take that design, create a mock. We could start to run requests, get some responses, build out a quick integration, or validate that the data is getting rendered out in the right way through our front end. We can really leverage that design again in a potentially a huge number of ways, in very useful ways. It's not just something that's nice to have. It actually becomes a functional and integral piece of our development process. So we'll dig into this a little bit more when we get into the demo and some of these different kind of components. I do want to talk a little bit about what if an API exists. So we get a lot of people, it's great that we have, this strategy, or we're adjusting to this design first approach as we kind of move forward with new services and development. But what if we have a legacy system? What if we have something that's, we've been working on for the past couple of years, and now you're telling us we have to take this whole new tact and restructure things? Not necessarily true. We can still leverage this design first approach, but we just have to think about it in a slightly different way. Essentially, as opposed to us generating the design as the initial kind of stage, we would generate that design as part of the build process. So essentially, it will become like an artifact that gets outputted from when we build or run the API, and then we could get feedback on that immediately. We could treat this as a much looser way of kind of getting feedback. We wouldn't necessarily have to stage it or allocate resources to stage it and loop people into our environment to get that feedback. We could get that same design spec, email it out, get our feedback early, implement it into our code, generate a new one. So there's some really interesting workflows there. And that same idea where we have testing kind of happening in parallel to the build process, we can absolutely start to leverage that as well. It's like if we hand off that design to our testing team, maybe we hand off our source code to our operations team and they start to stage and deploy, we can utilize the tests that are being generated at the same time. So we won't get too far into this. We will have some webinars coming out in the next few weeks that are specific to kind of more like this approach, this code first approach. Highly recommend though checking out Swagger.io. We've got plenty of resources around this. Annotation library is very useful, essentially adding tags and that kind of thing to existing code. Build runtime using some of these plugins or others. We can generate one of these specifications and start to utilize that in the rest of the process. But if we don't have access to the source code, if we don't have the ability to add annotations to what's being generated, I highly recommend checking out that Swagger inspector that's listed at the bottom of the page. This is a browser-based RESTful client. Essentially, it allows us to make calls against an API, either something public or something internal, even something running locally, and we can essentially convert the collection of requests that we make into a Swagger specification and then port it over into Swagger Hub. So we've got this direct relationship between this like list of calls. It's very cleverly going to kind of parse out all of the different parameters, all the different kind of paths that we might be defining, and where we might have something like a variable. Map that to a Swagger spec and then put it into a space for us to start to work against. So again, Swagger Inspector, it's free to use. It's out there. I highly encourage checking it out if again, you don't want to go down this annotation library path. Very useful tool that we see a lot of traction with when people are trying to migrate to this design first strategy. And before we get too much further, just some best practices. This is stuff, I've worked with a lot of customers and we've seen a lot of implementations and a lot of the OpenAPI spec being used at scale and Swagger tools being used at scale. And these are just some of I think the best practices that we see through these successful companies. First and foremost, get feedback as early as possible, right? The sooner we can update and make those changes to the design specification, as soon as we can validate that the design that we're kind of laying out is going to fulfill the requirements of the users and the consumers, the more successful the code is going to be and the less time that we have to spend kind of iterating over the code that we build. When we can lay out a very clear plan, when we can lay out, as much structure as possible for our developers to pick up and start to utilize, everybody's going to be happy. Developers don't feel like they're going back and reworking stuff that's already been worked on. Our end users are going to be delivered the kind of application or the API faster and sooner, and it's going to be more in line with what they initially described or defined. So this is a really important piece, whether we're working internally within our own team, getting feedback in that way, whether we're building a service that's going to be consumed internally by different teams, again, getting that feedback. Very important. If we have different teams, they might all have different needs. Let's get that feedback from all those teams and incorporate that together. And then finally, when we start exposing this publicly, if we want to, share with some trusted members, or we have a couple third parties we know we're going to be building APIs for, let's get feedback from them as soon as possible. And that way, when we actually push something live and into production, it matches those requirements that they originally intended. The next one here, standing up mock services. This is going to tick a bunch of boxes between that kind of design and the actual deployment phase. So we can use this to verify functionality. We can expose this publicly, or we can expose this to those third parties or those other teams. They can make requests, get responses, start to build out some integrations against that. We also see this being used to build tests against. So obviously, it's not going to be the fully fledged API, but if it's good mock, it should respond to different queries with different data. It should have a small logic layer that says, okay, if we've included all these different kind of components of the request, then I can go ahead and return this response. And we can use that as part of our testing structure. So when we actually are pushing out code and it's actually running, then we can use the tests that already exist to validate that and make sure that it aligns with that loose kind of mock that we originally defined. Obviously, this is a much lower cost kind of component to stand up. So instead of us saying, okay, let's run essentially like our production version of API and then let's run like a minified sandbox version, it still sounds expensive. It sounds like we're running almost a full version of an API, but it's a smaller scale. It's much, much easier for us to stand up essentially this dummy service. It doesn't have those dependencies and those requirements. It's a much kind of lower overhead when we actually go to kind of implement that. And we can utilize that as a sandbox instead. Consumers just want something that they can call and get a response from. I don't think anyone has the expectation that that sandbox is going to act like a production environment from start to finish. Some of the other things here, alerting users to upcoming changes. I think this is huge. When we take the time to actually design changes, and we actually have the ability to communicate those in a straightforward way to our end users, we can do that much earlier than when we actually are ready to kind of flip the switch on some code. Let's say that we put this together, this design together, it fulfills requirements at version 1. We've got version 2 that's coming out down the line. It's going to have some breaking changes. We can actually communicate that to users before we even start to write code, get maybe our feedback, as I mentioned before, but we can give them time to prepare so that when we actually start to stand up that version 2 of an API, they have the pieces of the puzzle to put together to start to work with what it is that we're standing up and hopefully leverage that new functionality much sooner than what we traditionally see. Nobody should be surprised when an API changes or when something is pushed to production. We should have our kind of end users kind of aware of that before we actually push anything out. Finally, this is one that I think is quite useful when we start looking at this at scale, but being able to leverage a platform solution. We think we have a really good solution with Swagger Hub. Essentially, it's taking all of these distributed open source tools, the editor and the UI component, and we've created this this organizational structure around it. So it makes it very easy for us to handle different teams, handle different permissions for those teams, introduce something like the feedback loop that I've been talking about, a commenting system within this tool. And we can also integrate very easily with a number of different other solutions. So having like this central kind of repository, the central space that houses all of our different API definitions and treating that as a source of truth that sits in the center of the rest of our processes, I think is a really powerful piece of what we can potentially do with these definitions and with this design first approach to building APIs. So yeah, definitely something I think that's worth taking away is the concept of, yes, it's great when we see teams do this in kind of siloed environments and kind of doing things like taking advantage of design first through their own groups. I think it's much more powerful. It just amplifies the power of the design first approach when we start doing this across like a platform or across an organization. We have like a workflow and a structure underneath that. So we'll talk a little bit about the OpenAPI ecosystem, Swagger, Swagger Hub, OAS, Swagger, what's the difference here? So at a very high level, just to level set anybody who's not super familiar with the specification itself, it's a contract for defining RESTful APIs. Pretty straightforward. It makes us ask these user-focused questions before we start writing code. When we actually have to sit down and say, okay, what is this API going to do? Not just let me, start to write a new path and a new method against that path, and here's what I think the, query parameters are going to be, and oh, we need to add a new one and another new one. Let's actually do that before we start writing the code. Let's actually do that as our initial stage, and it'll, make us ask, like, what information do we want the users to be able to access? And how do we want them to be able to access this? How can we make this as streamlined as possible? And how can we make it very easy for other teams to integrate? We don't want them to have to kind of be sending us 150 questions a day about, well, can I get this data? How do I access this data? Is this method exposed? Well, let's just lay it out in a contract, make sure that it fulfills requirements and kind of push that out. The OpenAPI specification is supported by the OpenAPI initiative. It's an open source kind of project. It's an evolving standard. We'll talk a little bit in just a second about the difference between like the 2.0 version of the specification and what is current now, the 3.0. But it's something that is overseen by a large number of different organizations and companies. The OpenAPI initiative has a lot of support across the industry. We see a lot of feedback coming in from the community as well. It's not just a collection of 5 or 6 companies saying this is the way it's going to be from here on out. It's a very kind of evolutionary kind of standard. So it's something that there's constantly feedback being rolled into. And I think we see that with the new functionality in 3.0. We took on a lot of requirements or extra pieces that users were asking for, made it more functional, didn't rewrite the spec. It just kind of layered in some of those new functions. Ecosystem of tools and support. This aligns more closely with Swagger. So Swagger was the name for the specification before 3.0 or before OAS. It's still the name for the tooling that surrounds the OpenAPI spec and what SmartBear helps maintain here. And it comes in a few different flavors. We'll talk about these as well in just a few minutes. But at a very high level, a place for us to edit OpenAPI specifications, a place for us to view them as documentation, and finally, ways to generate those without writing them manually. It breaks down into a couple of different pieces again, all under that Swagger umbrella. And finally, it can act as a source of truth across different kind of stages of development or of software deployment. So when we're writing code, we've got this contract to fulfill. When we're testing, we've got the contract that we need to validate or we use to validate the code that's been written. And then finally, when it comes to documentation, here is the specification as it lives. Here is exactly what we wrote the code to fulfill. Let's use that as the basis for our consumer docs. And hopefully it's verbose enough that they can very easily kind of take that in and make some calls against an API. So while we're talking about the specification, let's just introduce some of the differences, some of the key differences between 3.0 and 2.0. Right up at the top, and I think this was something that a lot of people really engaged was the simplified structure. All of the different components of 2.0 still kind of exist within 3.0, but they have, I guess the word would be consolidated. So a lot of the kind of structure has been like realigned and kind of parsed down. So it's a little easier, it's a little quicker to write. Anyone who's looking for more details on, some of these kind of key features, we have a terrific blog post on Swagger.io that kind of lays all of these out. We've got videos attached to them. Very cleanly kind of says, okay, here's what was in 2.0, here's what was in 3. It makes it very easy to kind of see that as opposed to me just telling you about it here. A couple of the other features, content negotiation support, very high level. This is more dynamic request body options. So it's not just JSON, XML. It's, okay, let's support form data. Let's support a different structure for those forms. Let's support different structures for all kinds of different request bodies. And again, this is just feedback. It's an iteration on what existed before. It's not like all of a sudden, there's a bunch of new request body options that we need to support. Those already existed. Let's just facilitate that in a much cleaner way. Same idea with the enhanced security definitions. It's a little bit of tweaking some of the naming conventions, aligning those with some changes that happened with those security definitions, and then rolling in support beyond that kind of base layer. Again, something that we got to my understanding, feedback was given and rolled into the new version of the specification. And again, just speaks to that kind of evolving and changing standard. Updated parameter types, pretty straightforward, just tweaking, changing, opening that up beyond the kind of defaults that we supported with 2.0. And in a similar vein, improved examples, just updating and expanding what has already been implemented. One of the nice things there, I think the ability to reuse and reference example values was pretty cool. So instead of us redefining over and over and over again in a specification, we can essentially use that same reference capability that we see in some of the other places within the specification, leverage that as part of the example field. I think OpenAPI links, this is kind of an interesting one as well, especially when we start thinking about some of the design flows or standards for RESTful APIs. It's very common to see like self-referencing or self-linking APIs where, we get a callback and maybe there's a user object, and then in that user object is also the path that we use to make or to get that user object again, or if we get an array of them, here's the path that we use to get an individual. Something that, we kind of presented workarounds for, the workarounds existed for in 2.0, but has been baked right into the 3.0 specification. So something that's definitely worth leveraging. And it's not like, I'm trying to remember the name, but it's not like it's going to enforce that you have to do it in a certain way. We just give you the ability to use it. So whether it's through one of these kind of design practices or design kind of methods or RESTful design patterns, or whether it's just a useful piece of functionality you think the API can support, now it's right in there. And finally, callback support, something that obviously we got a lot of feedback on and was rolled right in there as well. Again, any specifics that you want to dig into from this list, I highly recommend checking out that blog post. I reference it all the time. Bunch of good videos on there, created by some of the team from the OpenAPI Specification group, and it's well worth checking out on the blog there. Hopefully we can send a link to that around a little bit later. Last slide here before we get into the demo piece. What are the different tools? I've mentioned this Swagger ecosystem or this OpenAPI ecosystem. What are we going to be utilizing today as we go through? Swagger UI is going to be a big one. We see this used a lot for exposing the specification to consumers, to third parties, to people that we want to get feedback from. Essentially, it's going to take this bulky YAML file and port it over into something that's a little more readable. Obviously, it's cleaned up, it's stylized, it's got some really interesting functionality to make it interactive. So if we want to try a call against an API from within our documentation, it actually facilitates that. It's a really, really nice way to start to kind of expose OpenAPI externally. It's also something that's pretty customizable. So something I played around with a lot is, tweaking this and kind of moving it and wrapping it around some of the other, documentation support, like if we want to drop in tutorials and that kind of thing. It is pretty extensible. It's pretty customizable. I think it's a really nice way to start to leverage OpenAPI at the kind of final stage of deployment, exposing that documentation. Editor, this is something that we'll spend a little bit of time going through today. Allows us to very quickly create these specifications. One of the nice things here, if I'm brand new to OAS, never written a spec in my life, don't even understand the structure, it actually gives me feedback as I'm writing this. It tells me, hey, you're making an error in your indentation. Hey, you've forgotten a required field as defined by the spec. The editor does a really nice job of kind of suggesting or poking us in the right direction to make sure we have a valid specification. Finally, Swagger Core. This is one that I kind of mentioned earlier. Annotation libraries to drop into existing code, generate Swagger OpenAPI as part of a build or a runtime process, and very useful for existing APIs. So we see that leveraged for some of the more developed APIs or legacy services. Finally, Swagger Hub down at the bottom. This is the one that we really love and we work with a lot. This is our platform solution. So it's going to take all of these kind of distributed tools, all of these different components, and stitch them together into an individual workspace, into a single space. It then layers in user project management. It introduces like workflows and things like versioning, makes it very easy to kind of create some structure around that. And then finally, we've built in a number of integrations there. So, we're not expecting a Swagger definition to be the final stage of whatever it is we're doing. We want to try and push that into as many different gateways and repo systems. We want to generate as many SDKs and kind of service stubs as we can and hand those off to as many people as we can. So it does a really nice job of sitting in the center of a very large process or pipeline and acting as a source of truth for all of these different other tools that exist around APIs. Well, so I think I've talked enough about the specification at this point, and we can actually go ahead and dive in and actually take a look at creating one and building one out here, and some of the ways and features that we can start to leverage in doing that. Ryan, I just want to check in. Is there been any questions or anything before we dive too far into this? Anything that we want to touch on that people are bringing up?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's definitely a lot of questions coming through, and we're hopping on as many as we can here. Because so many of them are really focusing on the spec and some really specific examples of getting in here. I think it would be good maybe just to kind of see a spec in action. If you could dive in there, start to see the demo, and we'll do our best to address any of the questions we can. We know a lot of the questions that we're getting can be pretty detailed about what's new in OAS 3 and what's available. We're going to do our best to get as many answers as we can here. Again, we're dealing with pretty tight restraints, and as everyone knows, there is certainly a lot to cover. So I think if we jump in the demo now, and then we'll definitely be taking notes and doing our best to follow up and getting people answers that they need. So I would say let's hop right in.
Awesome. So yeah, this is going to be pretty straightforward. It's going to be pretty high level. Anyone who's worked with the specification before is probably going to be pretty familiar with the workflow that we go through here. Essentially, what we want to do is we want to create a new API as quickly as possible. Maybe I was sitting down at lunch with a couple of people from work, and someone from HR said they have all kinds of trouble getting and submitting user data through their API. They're a very technical HR group. So we had the idea, well, let's go ahead and build them a new interface that makes it a little easier and a little more streamlined to go ahead and do that. So as we mentioned before, we want to have that initial plan. We want to have a very high level structure or a rough idea of what this API is going to look like. And then we want to map that to one of these designs, to something that's a little more tangible and usable in the rest of our development process. Now, for our API today, we've got essentially a single path. Again, this is meant to be very straightforward. We've got a single path that we're going to build out. It's going to have two different methods underneath it. We're going to have a get method to retrieve data, existing data from the HR database. And we also have the kind of inverse. We want to be able to submit new user data to the back end, and we should be getting responses for each of those. 200 for when we generate or pull user data. We want to have what should be, I guess, a 201 when we submit something and it's stored successfully. And then in between, just as simple as possible, let's create a 404 that's going to be utilized by both of these here. So again, this is our kind of loose requirements, and what I want to do here is we'll go through and we'll talk a little bit about some of the functionality around the Swagger tooling and how we can leverage that to kind of expedite the development of one of these specifications or one of these designs. And then we'll copy paste in essentially the bulk of the spec and just go through it and take a look at some of the different ways that we can leverage OpenAPI to really streamline this design and make it as kind of reusable and scalable as possible. So I'm just going to go ahead and hopefully open up the right browser window here. Now on the screen, just anyone who's not been in Swagger Hub before, this is our platform solution that I keep referring to. I really like using this because it makes it very easy for us to kind of present the UI component, the editor all at one time. It makes it very easy for us to explain why or how we start to version things. So yeah, we'll just be working in here today. On the left-hand side, we have all the different organizations and the different components that I'm a part of. So maybe, we're going to be designing this new specification. We do this in our design org or wherever it might be. The idea of having these buckets or these kind of projects that we work under, again, is going to help kind of consolidate or expose exactly what we need to the right groups. So something, again, that we see a lot of people doing in their own kind of internal ways. But I think we can, again, start to leverage something like a platform solution to really facilitate that or enforce that across an organization. For us, let's just go ahead and create a new API here. I called out earlier today, so let's go ahead and do this with the 3.0 version of the spec. And we do support a number of different templates here. We'll just go ahead and do this one from scratch, just so we can see, when we're coming at this fresh, what does this look like? We're going to go ahead and create our HR API. Let's go ahead and version this, and we'll talk a little bit about versioning down the line. Something that I think is really interesting and something that's important when we approach this from a design first standpoint. Now let's just go give this a name, and there we go. Perfect. Visibility, this again is something that's contextual to Swagger Hub. Essentially gives us the ability to say, okay, this is a private API right now. It's something that we're only going to expose to our team or to a particular group that we want to get feedback from. But we can eventually tick this over and kind of say, hey, HR group, this is public. Go ahead, start to use it. It's in production. So go ahead and run requests against this, following these design rules. For now, let's leave it to private. We'll talk about the mocking capabilities a little bit later. But let's just go ahead and drop this under my, my own organization here. So the first thing that we'll see is that we're given this very loose kind of template. Again, we didn't start with anything. We didn't generate a template by design. But we've got this now workspace that we can start to use to fulfill those very loose requirements that we initially laid out. If we remember, we had a single path here. I believe it was either users or user. So let's go ahead and do that. And then we just had a couple of methods. And one of the cool things I think about this editor is, again, it's going to give us the ability to start to help make some suggestions as we build this. So things like different objects, snippets. I know that we have certain requirements underneath this, and we can see that the editor is actually telling us, when we're making these mistakes. So as we kind of move forward, maybe we make an indentation error as this scales up. It's very easy for us to do that. We can start to use the editor to kind of drive the way that we're writing this. In this case, we need to add a new description. There we go. What else do we need here? We need some parameters. If we think about that initial design, we had a few different ways that we could query this API and get some data back. So we want to make sure we drop those in as parameters. And then again, we have some new options here when it comes to the way that we structure this, but we have a very simple set of requirements. So let's just go ahead and add a new query parameter here. I think the first one that we laid out was a unique ID. So let's go ahead and add that. We do want to make it required. And this is another one that I think is kind of interesting. Let's say that we define something as required, but we never actually fulfill that requirements. We never actually lay that out as part of the thing that we're submitting or the data that should be coming back. The tool is actually going to tell us, hey, you said something is required, but you're not returning it or whatever else it might be. So again, this really works well at scale. As we start to build bigger and bigger APIs, as this thing starts to evolve, it's going to be a really nice kind of way of pushing us and poking and prodding us to fulfill those requirements as they were initially laid out. Finally here, let's just go ahead and define what this looks like. This is going to be, I think, a string. Now, this is one that is kind of true to life, and I've seen actually issues with teams using OpenAPI, but without communicating about it. So for instance, if I have something like a unique ID, and I know that it's going to be a string, if I don't define that and if I don't communicate that out, some users might interpret the unique ID to be an integer, or I might change this from a string to an integer without essentially alerting anybody. This is something that I've seen happen. And that obviously will break a lot of connections or a lot of the ways that we parse out responses or we submit requests to in this case, this HR API. So us having the kind of foresight and us taking the time to say, okay, this is what we're going to build and this is the design, and anything that changes from this, we're going to spin out into a new version and we're going to evolve on, I think is really useful and is something that can really impact how we work with other teams and how other teams, more importantly, work with us or work with the software that we're developing. So we could sit here all day and watch me fill out this specification. I don't think that's particularly interesting. So let's just go ahead, copy paste in the bulk of what we need here. And there's a couple of things that I want to talk through here now that we've brought this in. As you can see, we've still got our unique ID and the definition there. We've got a few other parameters. By design, we had a couple of responses for this API. And when we open up our documentation, we now see that we have all of this laid out. These example values, if we have a very particular structure maybe to this unique ID that I mentioned, we can actually see that represented. If I'm an API consumer, I know exactly what it is this is going to look like when I start to make queries against it. I can design my front end or my integration to support this format, and it's going to make it very easy, again, once I have this initial design, to start to build out my side of the equation as this API is actually being developed. So once we have this initial design, we can really leverage that across a number of different teams or kind of parts of the development process. Now, one of the nice things that we can support with this design first approach or with having this design is things like reusable assets. When we saw that our initial set of requirements, we had a 404. And the 404 is something that, let's just imagine, was standardized across the entire API. Instead of us writing that or having to write that a bunch of different times, essentially every time we invoke it, one of the nice things about OpenAPI is that we can create a reusable asset or a component and then just reference that. That means that we only have one place that we ever need to look back to pick up that standard or that definition. It also means we only ever have one place that we need to update this information if we ever want to make a change. So we'll find, for this get method, we have the 404 referenced here. For the post, it's the same thing. Really, really useful, again, in standardizing this. And when we look down now at the very bottom of the page, we actually have that 404 response defined. So if we wanted to update, I don't know, the message here, oh, that's a very bad request. We should see that this is updated now across the entire kind of application. Everywhere that 404 is referenced, we should get that new value. So again, a really useful piece of I think what we see teams start to use OpenAPI for, and this is actually something that we built on top of with Swagger Hub. So I think it's really nice that we can do this within the design itself. But let's say that we've got like 10 different APIs, or we've got 100 different APIs across 10 different teams. We can actually take this component or this library of reusable assets and we can store them in something completely different. Swagger Hub supports a kind of a component called a domain, which acts as a collection essentially of models that we create references back to. And if we have some time, we might explore that in a little more detail a little bit later. Great, so let's imagine we've gone ahead, we built out this initial kind of implementation. One thing that I think we brought in here but wasn't in our original design was this put method. So this essentially way for us to update existing employees, which sounds important, but maybe we just didn't think to include initially. So let's just remove that because, again, it wasn't in our initial requirements. And at this point, we've spent some time designing this. Let's go ahead and create this now and save it. And what was one of the big things that I kept kind of harping about in that theory piece, it was how do we get feedback, right? We want to now share this with whoever's going to be building integrations. We want to hand this off in such a way that they can start to give feedback. Now, one route that I see some users go down is to essentially download this as a JSON or a YAML file, attach it to a Slack channel or send it in an email. Get a list of feedback or start this group kind of chat and get feedback, pool it together, implement it, send out a new version. Useful, not particularly streamlined, and doesn't scale very well. Another thing would be to sit down in a room, pull up the documentation and say, okay guys, this is exactly what the API is going to serve up. This is how you're going to be able to access it. Any input at this point, we can tweak this and poke it and prod it a little bit. And kind of guide the structure that way. But again, it requires a lot of time, it requires a lot of input and management, and we end up supporting the process, I think, more than necessarily supporting the actions or the functions that we want to get out of this. Now, this is something, again, that Swagger Hub does really well. When we look on the left-hand side here, there's this little bar that supports commenting. So let's say that I was very opinionated, and I think that sending this ID back as a string doesn't make any sense. So we could go ahead and say, this should be an integer. Go ahead, leave a comment here. Now, this is one of the nice things where we can actually have a conversation about this definition, about this design. again, before we write any code, before we take this too far down any kind of process, we can resolve a lot of these issues early on, as opposed to us exposing this as part of a staged environment or something like that. We could have this conversation day one after I've written the specification, resolve some of these issues. Let's say, we go back and forth. I decide, okay, sure, it's a good idea. If it is an integer, maybe I should change it. Or I say, look, it's got those, hyphens in there. There's no way that's going to work. Eventually, we're going to want to resolve that. And again, one of the cool things I think here is that this exists as kind of like an element of traceability. We can always look back and see this conversation now against the spec. So I think it's something really interesting. And again, we built Swagger Hub to support this kind of workflow or using these designs and supporting these designs at scale across different teams, getting input from third parties, something that we can do very easily with the platform here. Eventually, maybe we've taken on our feedback. We've we've kind of thought this out. We've had a million conversations about the changes we need to make, and we've kind of resolved all of that. We're going to want to go ahead and publish this at some point. We're going to want to share this. And there's a couple of ways that we can do this with the tool. We could go ahead and publish this from within the platform. Essentially what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to essentially share this out to our different organizations. So we see right now that this is unpublished and private. We could change this, publish this API, and this is essentially going to create a read-only version. So my intent here is that we are never going to come back and start to make changes to this read-only version. One of the nice things here, if I ever unpublish this, everyone's going to get an alert and say, look, somebody has kind of rolled back this version, and hopefully they have a very good reason. We'll talk about how we iterate on this in just a second. But one of the other nice things that this ties into is some of the integrations that we support. So let's say that when I publish this definition, I want to push out all of my client SDKs to a specific repository. We can do that from directly within the tool. We now support OAS 3 within Swagger Hub for the code gen capability. So we do this for both a number of the client SDKs. This was something that we rolled out about, I think, 10 days ago. And we also now support server stubs as well. And again, we can start to push this into repositories. We could download this locally. People could access this through Swagger Hub if they wanted. So there's a lot of capabilities here. When we start to move this into development, or we hand this off to other teams who will be building integrations, there's some really nice functionality there. One of the other nice things that we want to think about is how do we iterate on this? As I mentioned, we have that put method that we never really thought about at the initial stage, but we get this immediate feedback once we've rolled out our initial deployment that, well, we have no way now to update, and what I'm doing is deleting users and then resubmitting them, and it's a total mess. So how do we now iterate on this design? Again, having this kind of workspace or having this platform is very, very useful. Essentially, we can say here, let's go ahead and create version 1.1.1, or maybe it's version 2.0, or maybe 1.5, wherever it might be. We can spin up this new version, and we now can think of this as like a catalog of all the different APIs, of all the different versions of APIs that we're going to support. And now we have this workspace where we could go ahead and go through that same like development process, where we come in here, we get our new functionality. Hopefully this is the right layer. Add that new put method that we heard so much about, and now we can go ahead, save this again, get feedback, implement any other changes, maybe consolidate some new suggestions in here as well. So a really nice way, again, to evolve beyond what previously existed. And one of the cool things I think with this tool is that we actually can define a default version. So let's say we have something that's running in production, is consumable. We want to treat this as like our documentation layer. People can search for an API here. They're going to get that default version back. But then if this is private, then I could start to, say exactly when this is going to be kind of exposed. So eventually this is going to run in production. We could set this as the default. And now we see when everybody searches for this, they're going to get this version 1.1.1. This is a really cool idea as well. If we start to tie this to like an external development portal or something, again, having this act as like the underlying source of truth, is that underlying repository, we can use a lot of this functionality to like feed these APIs out from here. Like if we wanted to push version 1.1.1 to a specific branch of our repository as opposed to version 1.0, us kind of breaking these versions out and storing them in a similar place but in a unique place, I think is particularly useful. Cool, so looking at the time, I think we have about 10 minutes left. I'm more than happy to talk about some of the other kind of components of the definition or some of the other like pieces of kind of Swagger Hub to facilitate this design first approach. Ryan, I don't know if there's any specific questions, anything that you want to bring up that would be a useful way to spend the next 10 minutes here.
Sure, yeah. We definitely have a good amount of questions, and we want to get to those as soon as we can. And thank you, everyone who's been patient on the line. We're doing our best to get to them as we go here, and appreciate everyone staying on the line. Before we jump into Q&A, I also want to let everyone know that we did just share a poll within the webinar. If you are interested in learning more about Swagger Hub or setting up time for a personalized demo or just getting a walkthrough about how you're developing APIs and seeing what's next from Swagger, definitely let us know. You can respond to the poll that way. I also wanted to let everyone know that we just shared a link to a survey in the chat window. Let me make sure everyone can see it here. Yep, in the chat window here. Just as a special bonus for anyone who does complete the survey, we're doing a state of API survey, which is basically looking at how the API industry has evolved and how people are doing different things. If you take the survey and complete it, you'll be entered to win a $100 Amazon gift card. But also, everyone at the webinar today who takes the survey will receive a Swagger t-shirt. So if you complete the survey, we'll know you did it based off that link, and we'll send you a t-shirt if you complete the survey. All right, enough of that. Let's jump into the questions, because I know there was a ton of them. Nathan, one of the features that you touched on early that people asked about was mocking.
Yeah.
They're interested in seeing kind of what does that look like in this
Yeah.
development, whether it's 3.0, 2.0, however they can use it.
Yeah. So that's a great question. Now, there's a bunch of ways that we can stand up mock services. There's like a million different open source libraries, and we develop a solution that we think is really powerful, something called Service V. We can like upload this mock this API spec, build out some logic there through this UI. If we want to forget about doing that outside of this kind of workspace, we can actually roll that functionality into Swagger Hub. From the top right here, we have this little integrations button. One of these that we support right now for 3.0 is the auto mock feature. Essentially what this is going to do is we'll just give this a name, HR API mock, something super creative. We're going to go ahead and create and execute this. And what it's going to do, it's going to stand up a mock service underneath Swagger Hub that is going to allow us to essentially make calls against a very specific kind of URL or a very specific endpoint. And it's actually going to serve up data. Now, the data that it serves up is just the example values that we lay out in this design. But if we think about doing this either from a documentation standpoint, like as a consumer who's eventually going to come in here and build an integration, if we can say, okay, what does my unique ID look like? How do we execute this? What kind of data is this going to send back? Very, very useful for me to get a very high level view of what this looks like. But this doesn't have to happen through the Swagger UI piece. It's great that we can expose this through documentation, but we could actually grab this curl command, run this from our command line and get data back that way. We could, build a request against this through our front end application, actually get a response back and parse it out and display it in our app. So I think that this is a really, really powerful way to start to leverage that design almost immediately, right? It's like as soon as I, essentially save this or publish it, or as soon as it moves into like my development phase, I could stand this mock-up and I could have my API developers working on the back end and making the connections there. But I could also alert my front end developers and say, hey, here's some new data that you guys are going to have to support. Here's the endpoint that you need to query to get that data. And they're essentially going to have something that is functional enough that they can make a call, get a response, and start to render that out. Again, it's a dummy service, it's a mock service. There's no like authentication layer wrapping this or anything like super complicated that we would typically see with a real API. There's no database that's going to store values when we make a post request. But the idea that we can make a request, get a response earlier, sooner, and with, as we saw, no code is really, really powerful. And we see teams really expediting the development process by using this across different teams. Good for testing as well.
Awesome. And I know another question, something you said there kind of reminded me of it. So a few people brought up authentication from within here, if they wanted to actually be sharing their docs and giving people access that way, but they have a level of like authentication that they're using. Is there anything in here that is supported in that area?
So yes, but it depends on the way that we structure our organizations. Like we could think of this as being a bucket of all the APIs in development and we throw everything together, or maybe we have like a Git repository that we throw our API specs and, obviously that will be handled by GitHub or Bitbucket or whatever the repository system is. But if we start to really think about how we structure kind of this workspace or this environment, we can break this out into different projects, organizations, and when we take a look at the way that we share and structure these APIs, we can essentially like define how people we bring in are able to interact with this. If I want feedback from, say Ryan, I could just type his user or email in here. He would get kind of a notification saying, hey, Nathan needs some feedback. And I could be very explicit in saying, I only want him to comment and view. I don't necessarily want Ryan coming in here and poking and prodding the API spec that I spend so much time on. We have that kind of level of control. We can also start to bucket people together into teams. So if I had, a group of like stakeholders from, I don't know, my documentation team, and I wanted them to come in here and actually start to edit this, well, we could go ahead and give them those privileges as well and kind of bring them in as a batch. So yeah, that's another piece of Swagger Hub that I think is really going to help when we start to use OpenAPI at scale. Having this authentication or this kind of method of defining who has access to what and when they have access to it, as well as the role that they have when they can see something, is only going to help and enforce like a kind of a pattern or a workflow to this design first approach to APIs. And again, especially useful when getting feedback. I want to be very clear who has access to an upcoming version of an API, and I want to be very clear on what they can do with that upcoming version. Maybe they want to view it, maybe they want to comment on it. It's important to have the right people with the right functionality, like supporting our development process.
Cool, thanks a lot. And then someone asked, and I know I don't know if we offer full support. So I should say we've got a lot of questions around some of the different languages we support, and a lot of that as well. And I think we've been evolving over time in terms of the level of support that we offer. I do think with the latest release of CodeGen, it was certainly quite an addition, because I know people have been asking for that. But it is possible that there will be languages that we don't support today that you're using. We typically recommend, keep an eye out on the CodeGen open source, where you'll see, typically we'll see them released there, and then we'll bring them into Swagger Hub. So I know we can't answer. I know everybody would love to get direct answers on a lot of that stuff. We do our best to be as transparent as we can, but we also do rely on the community to help us, get those to full support as well. But on that, we also received a question around, using Swagger Hub with like source control. And I know we offer sync there, but then someone was also asking if you were to, push there, could you also tie it in with something like Jenkins and make that work as well? I don't know if we'll be able to dive in and actually show a demo of that, but I know maybe you could just at least talk to it if not.
That's actually a pretty cool question. So, we do support like pushing the coding pieces, like my client SDKs to repository systems and like saying, okay, write this to my Node.js folder in this repository or branch or whatever. But if I want to think about this in kind of a more programmatic way, we can actually make queries to the backend of Swagger Hub. And, if we wanted Jenkins to say, pull down, I probably have to structure that differently. If you want to say have Jenkins pull down like a definition to utilize as part of a test framework or something like that, we have a really powerful API underneath Swagger Hub where we can start to query it and get all of that data back. So yeah, we don't have to use the integrations. They're very useful when moving data from Swagger Hub out, but we can actually start to pull stuff down as well. So if we think about this as that repository, as that centralized system, we have Jenkins, maybe another team uses TFS, or maybe we have like a cloud kind of deployment strategy or something that needs to pull down these specifications. We can do all of that through this like API that lives underneath this platform. So it's pretty cool. We can even do something like where we make a query and we get back the default version. So as this kind of evolves and we publish new stuff, as opposed to us constantly updating the Jenkins kind of workflow and whatever to make different queries, we can just say, hey, get the default of HR API and use whatever that may be. And in that way, we could use this to kind of continue to work and evolve and define, act as that source of truth, but then we would have all the other stuff underneath it, just pulling down default versions and very easily kind of updating itself without us necessarily having to go in and change all of those implementations. So some pretty cool stuff there for sure.
Awesome, fantastic. I guess we have probably one time for about one more question, and I know there's certainly a lot that we weren't able to get to, but let me just quickly look, see if we can pull one up. I know there's a couple of recurring ones. A few people asked about the virtualization aspect that Nathan talked about, and they asked what the tool was he mentioned, and that was Service V. We do have some mocking, but there's also Service V that goes on top of that, which I shared a link to if people have any questions there. I guess this would be a good one to end on. Someone mentioned referencing these reusable components that you brought up. What does that tactically look like for people? Is there a separate view where they can see all of those, and how are they actually referencing those across the specs?
Could you repeat that, sir?
Yeah, so it looks like they're interested in seeing, like, within Swagger Hub, where do these reusable components that you spoke about, like, where do they exist?
Yeah, I was actually just reading someone, a bunch of people plus one, somebody's question about reusable elements or persisting like an object that we use in a post request and it's going to be part of a response or something like that. I kind of mentioned that we can do that at a spec level. So if we have like an object or a model that we want to reuse, maybe it's a response or maybe it's something a little more stripped down, like just a user object or a parameter value or something like that. We can totally do that down at the bottom of the specification as part of these components. And then as we see, create references down to that. So it could be, an object that I refer as part of my response. It could be something that I submit. But one of the nice things about Swagger Hub is that we can actually take this to the next level. If we have, as I mentioned, like 100 different APIs across 10 different teams, and we want to standardize something like a response, we can actually take all of those different assets, all those different objects and responses and all the different references that they might support, and we can store them in this domain element. And now we have just a single source of truth for all of these, in this case, objects and parameter values. What we see on the right-hand side is that we have this model definition. It looks very similar to what we would have laid out inside of Swagger Hub or inside of the OpenAPI spec. We have in this case, a definition or a reference to another kind of object that lives within here. But now if we go and we take a look at one of these APIs, let's just jump right into one that I think has a reference. It's looking to that domain. So this could be a response. It could be something that we're submitting here as part of my body request. And these always get resolved. So to the end user, to the consumer, it wouldn't look any different than if we defined it in the specification itself. But now we have just one location that we would have to go and update this and maintain this, and only one location that we have to look back to. So I could have all these distributed teams trying to reference this stuff. And we could have someone totally separate, like a very specific architecture group whose job it is to maintain, support, define exactly what a book object looks like, or what an author looks like, or what data is supported. Whether we add, we now support 3.0 and we add like a reference or a link in there. Okay, now we only have one place that we have to define that, and we can just have everybody kind of create references back to that essential central library. And again, just creating as many reusable and standardized assets as possible. I think this is really, really important. And it's something that we use obviously a lot in the specification itself, that components library down at the bottom. But I think when we think about this at scale, there is some really powerful functionality when we do this like through a separate domain, when we reference something external. I think this is a really cool way to start using the specification. Hopefully that answers the question.
Awesome. Well, folks, we are about 5 minutes over time here, so I want to be conscious of people's schedules. I know we weren't able to answer everything, but I do hope this was a good use of everyone's time. As we always try to do, we'll try to follow up with as many answers as we can. And so I would keep an eye on the Swagger blog if you can, and we'll certainly have more information there as well. And that's also where we'll have some more information about the latest releases of OAS 3 support. If you are interested in learning more, you can always visit swagger.io and you can find Swagger Hub there. Or if you want to get a chance to, set up a call here, we can always reach out and have the team follow up with some more information. At this time, I'm going to have to wrap up. I want to thank Nathan again for an awesome presentation, and thank you everyone who joined today's webinar. I really appreciate it. So thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.